Hello, everybody. This is Andy Revkin, the founding director of the Earth Institute and now Climate School Initiative on communication and sustainability. So my whole life my professional life has been about trying to make information matter. It started out as traditional journalism. It's kind of a one-way street. And everyone here now, you'll see today on screen, is someone who is part of the interface between knowledge, data, knowledge, and impact. It involves communication among disciplines, communication with practitioners, between climate science and people conveying it to the public, like weather forecasters. It involves basic education of the public and social media. And I can't think of a better gathering, a gaggle of people to get at this than today's panel, which I will be handing off shortly to Jeff Berardelli, who has a master's degree from the pre-climate school. I guess you could say it's the climate school now.
I just missed it. I just missed it, Andy, by like a year or two.
I know, but it's fantastic to have you really be part of the Columbia community along with your work at CBS News. And it's great following the way you intersperse basic weather coverage with climate insights is very special, as others on this panel do as well. So Jeff will be running the show, and we're joined today by Kate Marvel, a research scientist at NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies and at Columbia University. She is a spectacular communicator of science. Also, I would say you're a great insight and inspiration for others, young scientists trying to figure out how to make a difference in the field as well. Everything from TED Talks to your social media presence and Scientific American work. We have Bernadette Woods-Plackey, meteorologist and director of Climate Central's Climate Matters program, National Science Foundation funding. And again, a great interface, not just between information and the public, but a way to train meteorologists and newsrooms on how to convey information more effectively. Vanessa Murdoch, who is a frequent presence for anyone in the New York area, CBS Channel 2 News meteorologist and reporter, who was on one of the other sessions we did a year ago for the Lamont-Doherty Earth Observatory Open House, which is what this is. And finally, Marshall Shepard, who I've gotten to know as a reporter source when I was covering everything from the big deluges around Baton Rouge and the idea of the brown ocean, how inland water can heat up and energize storms, to all the work you've done at Forbes magazine. There's a great story about how you chose to do your column there, and your social media work too. And I didn't even mention, of course, you're a professor at the University of Georgia's Department of Geography, director of the university's Atmospheric Sciences program, former president of the American Meteorological Society, and now elected to both the National Academies of Engineering and Sciences. So bravo to you on so many fronts. So Jeff, I'm going to say over to you. And I can't wait to hear the next hour. Maybe we can go a little longer depending on how things go. So thank you again for being here, everybody.
I'm glad to be here. In fact, I'm excited to be here because these are all my favorite people. Honestly, I know so many of you personally. It's so great to be with you. Andy, do you remember where we met for the first time? At the Seinfeld Diner. We met at the Seinfeld Diner. We had lunch at the Seinfeld.
Oh, the diner. Yeah. That's right.
On the Upper West Side of Manhattan by Columbia University. So
right under the Goddard Institute for Space Studies.
That's right. Yep. It looks different inside than it does on Seinfeld, in case any of you are wondering who are watching.
It's true.
That's beside the point. So I just want to welcome everyone, welcome our guests, welcome the folks that are watching from home. This is an important topic. How do we communicate climate change effectively, right? One of the problems, obviously, with climate change is you can have all the data in the world, and we know this from a lot of different science disciplines, but it's not always digestible to the public, nor does the public often want to hear what you have to say, especially if what you have to say is somewhat inconvenient. So it's very important that there are good communicators out there. And some of the folks...
Jeff, can I just interrupt for a second?
Yeah, sure.
Speaking of bad communication, I forgot to introduce Robbie Parks, an environmental epidemiologist here whose work I got to know because he's interfacing with newsrooms. He helped to work on a project on heat and mortality and morbidity in the Southwest and everywhere else. And Robbie is a young superstar emerging here in the Columbia campus. Robbie, sorry about that.
No, it's okay. I thought maybe I had the wrong meeting, but then
never. Yeah, you epitomize what we're all about here. So the idea of interfacing between these different entities. So sorry, back to you, Jeff.
Thank
No,
you.
it's so important because as I was at Columbia, I realized that we so needed that interface. We needed to be able to communicate from, the scientists to the public. I mean, scientists can produce as many great abstracts and great studies as they want, but if that stuff doesn't get to the public, then in a way where they can digest it, then it doesn't do that much good. We can beat our heads against the wall like we have for the past 30 years trying to get this message out for climate change. So this is a really important opportunity that we have right now. And certainly you notice that journalism is doing a lot more climate change now than they were just a couple of years ago. So with that said, all the folks that you see in your boxes there are some of the best of the best of the best in the world at that interface between science, real science research, and communicating science through journalism. So I'm going to start, first of all, let me start with you, Kate, because first of all, I missed you also by a year. If I had just waited a year, you could have been my professor in the master's program. And by the way, I love your writing. Kate, if you have not read Kate's writing, she is one of the best writers out there. I see Marshall doing that. So Kate, let me ask you this. First of all, I want to know a little bit about your research. What's your real focus today? But how the heck do you go from being a good scientist to a good writer like that? Those are two sides of the brain. It's not fair that you have both of those sides of the brain. Not all of us have that.
Wow, thank you. I guess I'll talk a lot about my research because that's something that I'm very comfortable talking about. So I am interested in all aspects of this amazing planet that we live on. I always say that I did my PhD in physics. I actually studied something called cosmology, which is the study of the entire universe. And I very quickly realized that all of the universe is terrible except this planet. Space is great, but space really wants to kill you. And so I got more and more interested in this amazing planet that we are so privileged to get to live on. So I am interested in how the planet works. I'm interested in how the climate has changed in the past, how it is changing right now, and how it might change in the future. And so that means that my research is really all over the place in a good way. I've done a lot of work on droughts, a lot of work on understanding why the sky gets thirsty and what that means for land areas. I've done a lot of work on what we call climate sensitivity. So basically, how hot is the planet going to get in response to doubled carbon dioxide? And then I've done a lot of work on kind of putting these current changes into the long-term context. That is incredible. I've gotten to work with amazing, brilliant people. And it's something that we don't just use one tool for. We use climate models, but we also use observations, both from space and from the ground, reconstructions of past climate, basic physics. So you get to work with a lot of great people and you get to use a lot of really interesting tools as well. About the writing, I actually disagree that science and writing use different parts of the brain. I think when we do science, when you write a scientific paper, that's writing, and that's storytelling. Because if your scientific paper were an accurate record of exactly what you did, it would be unreadable. It would be like, I was really confused for 4 months, and then I took a shower, and the idea came to me, and then that didn't work, and then I debugged some, and it would just be completely unreadable. And so much of doing good science is being able to understand what you've done, put it into a context, and explain it so that it matters. And that's how you tell a good story too.
Very good. Hey, Robbie, I want to ask you the same thing. Tell me about your research and how it kind of relates to our seminar today.
Well, thank you, Jeff. So first of all, it's great to be on this panel, and really in awe of many of the other people here. So first of all, thank you for inviting me. So, I'm an environmental epidemiologist, and I have a background in physics, but then I slowly moved away from that during my PhD. And so, I have experience in, large scale, multidisciplinary quantitative research about first of all, where climate and climate-related exposures are affecting people, how they're affecting people's health, and also what I'm very interested in more and more is what to do about it to actually enact the most positive change. And by exposures, I mean, currently I'm doing a lot of focus on tropical cyclones and hurricanes and the effects they have on health. But I've also worked a lot on mental health effects of temperature and things like that. And so I really enjoy, and I think I found myself in this field because I found that it seemed to me the most effective way to try and communicate my interests of the impact of the environment to the public, and there was a lot of sort of gaps there, and the way that I do that is by telling stories really about what happens to humans. And so when I talk about the health impacts, I feel that a lot of reception is quite sort of engaging. People tend to want to know about what's going to actually happen to people, be it air pollution, be it tropical cyclones and hurricanes, or be it heat waves and elevated heat, and other things, many other things. So that's why I'm very sort of interested in communicating the human impacts of climate change.
And so I want to bring Marshall in here because Marshall, you've been a pioneer in kind of communicating climate change. You reach a very large audience. What do you think we need to do to really effectively get this message out and kind of get people to understand the urgency of this issue?
Well, first of all, thank you, Jeff, for hosting this and for everything that you do in this same space, and to all of my colleagues as well. It's really an honor. So the first thing I would say is let's get a big, gigantic water bomb and drop it on academia, because we are doing a terrible job at preparing scientists to communicate this topic. If we are not the sort of communicators in a space where we deal with a controversial topic, there are certainly people that are willing to fill those gaps and voids that we leave behind because we were either as scientists unable to communicate the material or unwilling to because of these prehistoric sort of Fred Flintstone sort of thinking processes that academics should not engage more broadly in the public. And so I think we should have to fundamentally reshape the way we are preparing future scientists, graduate students, and students to communicate science. When we're in our academic programs, we teach them how to write theses and dissertations and present at conferences and write grants, but we don't teach them media training. We don't teach them writing skills. And I completely agree with you about Kate. Her writing marvelous. Did you see what I did there?
Yeah, it was great. I did.
And we also don't teach them how to engage with stakeholders, policymakers, and so forth. So I think that's where we have to start. But then we also have to really kind of come back to the kitchen table issues that I often talk about, sort of, move the narrative. And I think this is increasingly happening, move the narrative beyond sort of polar bears in the year 2080 and talk about the price of cornflakes and gas prices spiking up after there's a hurricane barreling through the Gulf of Mexico. I think people resonate with those things. And so I think that's starting to happen. And we need more honest brokers out there communicating. And this is why I'm pleased at what Bernadette and her colleagues are doing at Climate Central, because they don't see scientists like me and Kate often. People in the public see people like Vanessa more than they see scientists in some academic ivory tower institution. And so I'm glad to see that there's more engagement in broader spaces like local newscast or the Weather Channel or Forbes.
I'm always singing the praises of folks like Bern and what they're doing, or Climate Central is doing. And I want to bring Vanessa into this conversation too, because for me at least, Climate Central was a real door opening into communicating climate change. When I started to really communicate climate change several years ago, there was a bit of apprehension. How am I going to produce good content? Do I have to worry about viewer backlash? Do I have to worry about being fired by my managers for speaking the words climate change? All those things were tough. And so, Climate Central was great in kind of taking you by the hand and helping you at your own comfort level figure out how to kind of engage on this topic. So, Bern, you first. How big has this program become? I know it's not just meteorologists anymore, it's reporters as well. And also, have you noticed a distinct change in the willingness and perhaps less apprehension of jumping into and communicating climate change among the people that you're helping?
Well, thanks for your kind words, everybody. This is a group effort. All of us are really in this together, right? Trying to advance the subject matters in ways that matter. And to your point, Jeff, the program itself did start out with TV meteorologists, and it's grown significantly over the past couple of years. It's about 10 years old now. So we've got a few years under us, but those first few years really were addressing barriers and trying to take those barriers down. As you were saying, the fear. And it turns out the fear was so much bigger than the reality. We've all learned in this space, and I don't know how many who are watching with us today understand the global warming 6 Americas, but we can share that in the chat for you. But there's this perception that the world is more against the subject matter than there really is. So that's one of the barriers we had to address. The second one was how you can do it, how you can make these connections in scientific ways that matter to your audience. And then the third was really diving into specific types of science. There were questions about the difference between weather models and climate models and different topics like this, right? That we could get scientists and meteorologists together and really start digging in. Now, over the years, the program has grown now to more than 1,000 TV meteorologists. And for perspective, there are about 2,000 in the US, about 2,200 right in there. There's also a really great group internationally, but that's a much smaller pool because media systems in other countries aren't quite the same way they are in the United States here with our robust local news organizations and our system and our ecosystem. And since we've added on journalists now too, we're at more than 800 or 900. So we're about 2,000 people now in our network that we're dealing with, and it is growing all the time. At this point, people coming to us in really great ways, and through such a different range of introductions, from seeing content out there that they like to use or having a specific question about a specific aspect of climate science and how that pertains to a story that they're working on or a question they got from a viewer, or even really jumping into connecting with specific scientists. I mean, we work with Spanish language media also, and we might need a Spanish speaker on a specific topic in a specific part of the country. So helping through that whole range of supporting this network, also producing weekly content, and on top of that, these types of events, how we can get in front of people and help them understand that society wants to hear about this and how they want to hear about it and how we can take that to the next level.
So Vanessa, I want to invite you into the conversation now. First of all, Vanessa doesn't know this, but she is one of my favorite TV meteorologists.
Oh,
you do such a wonderful job. Honestly, you're one of the best. That's the truth, and I do mean that. So I'm going to ask you this because I always wonder, even for myself, is it our responsibility as meteorologists, as TV meteorologists, to communicate climate change? Should that be part of our job? Is it? I mean, it may not be required by our managers, but do you think, in kind of a theoretical way, that's now part of the job that we have? I'm asking you both personally, but then also generally speaking, when you look at the industry, would you be comfortable saying to a meteorologist in wherever that, this is not just an optional thing anymore. This is really a core part of your job? I'm curious.
I would say, honestly, that it is not a core part of my job. And I think that over the years, it's become a more obvious part of my job. But it's definitely not, I wouldn't say to a meteorologist coming up, like, you better be a climate expert too. Because I will say quite honestly that I am not a climate expert. And anytime I do a story on climate, I'm bringing in somebody like Mr. Shepard or Kate to talk to me about the science behind the climate story that we're trying to tell, because my focus daily is not on climate change. Do I think it's important that it's part of my job? Yes, but it shouldn't be, I don't think that it should be 50% of my job. You know what I mean? I think that I'm happy to include it as part of my repertoire, but not as the climate expert, because that is a whole other course load that I didn't focus on in school. Yeah. So I need to go back to school like you so I can speak to it as an expert.
But you probably are more of an expert than you even know that you are, believe it or not.
Yeah, I mean, obviously I have some knowledge that others don't, but I much prefer to turn to those who study, Robbie, Kate, again, that this is their bread and butter, that weather obviously is a big portion of climate and change, but I don't do the science behind the change. I just read up on it.
Yeah, I know Bernadette wants to kind of jump in on this as well. So Bern, what do you think?
Well, the way I view it, having been a broadcast meteorologist myself, is I always viewed the role as a way to keep people prepared and safe. I mean, you grow up being fascinated by the weather, but you quickly see what it does to people and how it can harm people. And as you learn about the science, you see how it's changing and how climate change is changing our weather. And that's where I always viewed it as a role, again, just an extension of keeping people safe and prepared and making those connections in the moments that matter. I don't think it necessarily needs to be divided into categories. I see what you're saying, Vanessa, but I think there is a thread that carries through so much of our weather in very meaningful ways. And so that's where there's the opportunity to connect the dots in the moments, in things that are threatening people, whether it be a sunny day where there may not be a climate connection, but then when you get flooded out, making that connection, it just comes back to the core science. And I'm saying this not about you, Vanessa, because you do a fantastic job, but some people out there are still overthinking this, I think sometimes, whereas just make the connections where they're happening, because you do, and again, this isn't you, Vanessa, there's a lot of the meteorologists out there, you do know more than your audience knows. And they have a lot of questions. And this is that chance to help them understand. And again, from so many of us in the meteorology space, really just trying to keep people safe. And it really does come back to that core. And as we see these events getting stronger and more impactful and taking, I mean, just it still sits so close, living in New Jersey with Ida, what Ida did, and how many people died of flooding that did not need to from that storm. I mean, this is just an opportunity to help society understand and prepare for the future. And that's just where my perspective always came down with this.
I'll just add that with Ida specifically, still on that day, we're forecasting for it, right? And then the opportunity to discuss the impact of climate change arises in the stories that come after. And that's where, that's how at least it plays out in this environment, because the critical concern in the moment is to make sure people know that it's going to flood and it's going to be really unfortunate. And then the opportunity rolls in to explain why this particular event is related to climate change. And then I bring in experts who can tell you even more about how many of these events across the globe are related,
And I think and that's a good point, because it's up to the individual meteorologist to decide where their comfort level is. These are, I can tell you from doing what I've done, just background for the folks who are watching, meteorologist for 25 years, but recently went back, got my master's degree, and I'm doing, in climate, and I'm doing both. And it is two jobs. I sometimes find myself going back and forth all day between, what's the price of solar and wind today? And then, oh, by the way, is there going to be a tornado in Kansas? Which, clearly there are two separate things there. But I will say that coming in with a climate perspective as I'm predicting a weather event is really useful, because during Ida, the night before, so maybe 18 hours before the event, I posted a story on CBSNews.com that a once in 100-year event was coming, because I didn't notice that it was being communicated like that. Of course, everyone was talking about big flood event, lots of heavy rain coming, this is going to be really bad. But how do you then put that into perspective so people understand, wait a second, this is something you've never experienced before. This is not just a bad flood. This is something you have no perspective on because you haven't lived through anything this bad before. And so coming at it with that climate helmet on helped me to, I think, communicate in a way where I could give people that extra understanding. Stop what you're doing. I know you've heard this a million times. I know you've heard that it's going to rain heavy a million times, or there's going to be a big flood a million times. This is different. So I would say that coming at it from that climate perspective really helped me in that particular situation. So I know we definitely have just at least I think one question now from one of our viewers. So I will get to that in a second, but I do want to bring everybody else in on this conversation. I always thought that because I'm at the intersection between TV and communication, and science, having been a meteorologist for years, that it was kind of my responsibility to kind of try to let people understand how important climate change is and how much of an impact this is going to have, just because of where my expertise lies and the fact that I have a platform. So I want to bring everybody else in. I want to necessarily have to call on each one of you, but Marshall and Kate and Robbie, how do you feel about that? Where does the responsibility lie for this communication? Marshall, I'll ask you because you're probably right there on at that.
Did you ask where does the responsibility lie for the miscommunication?
No, for the communication of this. Like, who do you? So as someone who works, who has your own show, but also as a professor, who's really responsible the most for communicating this? Is it everybody? Is there a certain sect?
Yeah, I think it's a multivariate problem to use science lingo and jargon, which we need to stop using in public spaces. But I think that we, as the sort of knowledge brokers and knowledge generators, as scientists, we're doing the studies, and of course, in science or in climate communication, the peer review literature, that's our FDA approval. I think people now understand that when we think about the viruses and the vaccines that we're dealing with. People like, oh, I don't want to, until it gets the FDA approval, I don't want to stick it in my body and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, well, I have the vaccine and everyone hopefully will get vaccinated. But my point is this: all of a sudden, people understand the value of review, of authoritative and credible review. Well, that's what the peer review is for us as climate scientists. And so when we see tweets and blogs and TV station opinions and so forth spouting climate information, it hasn't been peer reviewed. That's just like putting Clorox or something in our system or something. It's not been vetted. And so I say all of that to say that we as scientists have a role in the scientific peer review process. But here's the but. My aunt or my cousin is not pulling up the Journal of Atmospheric Sciences or Geophysical Research letters. They don't read the journals. So even though I'm a fairly well-published scientist with over 100 peer-reviewed articles in the literature on various topics over the years, I mean, at best, if I pull up my Google Scholar citations, it's probably in the thousands. I can reach millions on Weather Geeks and Forbes. And so I think it's important that we're translators. So it's our responsibility as scientists to put the information out there in ways that people consume. But the reality is colleagues like you all have the reach and skill set to convey it in ways that can reach even broader audiences. So that's why I say it's a multi responsibility challenge.
I definitely see a separation between scientists like yourself, Marshall, and you, Kate, and you, Robbie, and other scientists who are not very media savvy. And I know when I was at Columbia, I would often get upset. I was thinking to myself, boy, I really wish I could deliver for the scientists at Columbia kind of a media session on how to get their information out there, right? We all know, Vanessa knows this, the best thing to do is when something happens that's related to your research, call the TV station that morning, call the newspaper that morning, get in touch with the journalists that you know already, because it's very possible that a newsroom is like, oh, we want to cover this story. How do we cover this story? So the best way for scientists is to say, I have research, and you wait for the day when there's a hook. And then you frantically for an hour or two, write those people like me, people like Vanessa, people like Byrne. I can solve this, because believe me when I tell you, you will get bites from media on that day. And of course, the media cycle lasts 24 hours. So you better do it. You better do it within the first day. I'm not even 2 days now. Maybe you had 2 days 5 or 10 years ago. Now you have a day. And so that's, I think, an important lesson. But something that I noticed that a lot of scientists were missing is that ability to kind of to get out there and to get their information across to the public. Kate, what made you decide to bridge that gap? And do you notice that your colleagues are resistant against it, or do you feel like a lot more of them are kind of coming on board and they realize that it's important to bear some of the responsibility for communication?
I mean, I see a massive generational divide. I think there is an old guard that views science as, something that you can do safely within an ivory tower and the published literature. The young people don't think that. Talking about the master's students, talking about the incoming PhD students, everybody is doing the science because they see that it's relevant. And I think especially, the COVID pandemic was such a brutal reminder of this. There was no such thing as a purely scientific issue. You can develop the vaccines, and in my opinion, the vaccines are miraculous, but if you can't get them in people's arms, it doesn't matter. I think there's an increasing understanding that the way scientific communication works is not scientists say something and everybody listens to us and acts on exactly what we say. And that's not how it should work. Climate change is not just a scientific problem, it's a social problem. And that is both a really frustrating thing, but it's also a really kind of empowering thing, because that means that everybody has a role to play here. Everybody has a role to play in the communication of the problem, and everybody has a role to play in the solution.
Robbie, I know you wanted to jump in on this.
Yeah, thanks. I definitely broadly agree that scientists need to be better communicating their work. And every single scientist that I work with and have the privilege of speaking with, including all of you, really can clarify the issues very well. So I don't think it's really an issue of necessarily training fundamentally. I think it's really an issue of incentive for those scientists. So for me, when I do those, when I have communicated to the press, I do that because not necessarily that I like my name appearing in the paper. It's really that I see the benefit of it, but not because I think it's necessarily going to help my career at the moment. I think it will in some sort of diffuse way, but I don't think it's quantified and appreciated for the career ladder. And I was just speaking to that point in a Q&A point, and I think that is really a big issue here. If academia as an institution doesn't recognize it in any sort of appreciable way beyond, oh wow, well, we've got a guy who seems to be on the news a lot in our faculty, then I think we're going to have the same old problem. And that goes for all science, actually, not just climate science or climate impact science. I think that's really where I see the bottleneck. And I say I have 8 hours plus in a day to work. Am I going to spend it all doing my research, which is what I'm paid to do, or am I going to do it trying to do something else which I'm not paid to do, and which may not get me further? And so that's really where I see the bottleneck in the way people are communicating their science.
So it's almost like academia needs to carve out a space for this. Marshall, you kind of mentioned that, I think, at the beginning, that academia needs to figure out how to incentivize this, or to at least raise the level of importance among its professors.
Yeah, we're not incentivized to do engagement. In fact, as someone that does I publish, I do all the science things that we're evaluated on in academia, publishing papers and getting grants. But the most common thing that people always ask me, and I bet Kate gets it too, and Robbie, how do you find time to do all that extra stuff? But here's the problem, and here's my comeback. It's not extra stuff to me. My tweeting, my engagement in Forbes, the Weather Channel, that's part of my scholarship. It's not extra stuff. And so and that's one of the things I'm arguing within academia. We've got to change this narrative that it's extra stuff. But it is, I'm not naive. Young professors, young scientists in a government lab, they're promoted and tenured based on things like, how many grants did they receive, or, how many papers they publish. So here's what's kind of just ludicrous about that in my mind, as someone that's been in academia for a while now. The scholars doing the most interesting, important, and innovative science are usually some of the young scientists and professors, but yet they're not incentivized to go talk to CBS or go write an op-ed in Forbes or to go testify before Congress, because at the end of the day, 5-6 years from now, where they're coming up from tenure, people are not, that was nice, thank you for doing all that extra stuff, service, it makes the university look great, but it's not, there's no currency to it, and we've got to change that model.
I mean, it sounds a bit like capitalism, right? I mean, the more money you bring in, the better chance that you have of being promoted, right? I mean, that's the system that we're in.
Well,
right?
but here's the side of that, though. That's true. But also, guess what? The more money you bring in, the more you're able to publish and engage broadly. And that can lead to other collaborations and other scholarship, which can lead to more money and more grants. And so, and it's not about grants, because one of the biggest thing, I want to make that point, because one of the big skeptical arguments out there are zombie theories. Oh, so you scientists are about sort of making up climate change because it's about grant money. Well, no climate scientists I know, their salaries or grant monies are anywhere close to some of the profit margins of some of the companies on the other side of the climate issue. So it's never really been about that, but that's kind of how some try to frame it. But even that's going away. But to your point, yes, Jeff, but there's also another part of capitalism that involves marketing and engagement, and academia to me just hasn't learned that side.
Yeah. Does anybody else want to jump in on this? Because if not, I want to try to get through a couple of questions that some of our viewers have asked about. Okay. All right. So one of the questions is, what are your takes on how climate science has or has not informed the current congressional debate on climate pollution reductions? So do we feel that climate science has gotten through on the congressional debate, that it's informing it in a constructive way? I don't know who's best equipped and who wants to answer this question. Anybody want to raise your hand as to who might want to answer this question? We don't have too many politicians here. Okay, Robbie, take a shot.
Well, I guess there's just a whole, the whole sort of debate about pollution limits with WHO and the EPA, that behind that is decades of work on air pollution impacts on health. And so, it does take more than a village. It takes cities and cities of academics to change those limits. Mm-hmm. And so that really speaks to the necessity that we have for communicating, but also doing the hard science of understanding the relationship between mortality and morbidity at even low air pollution levels to push it even lower. So that's what I would say. I say it is having an impact, but not necessarily by recent sort of communication, but by hundreds and hundreds of papers talking about the impact of pollution. But that is specifically about pollution.
It's finally entered the mainstream here in the US under Biden. I mean, he definitely brings peer-reviewed research into his speeches. I mean, look, they just revamped the NOAA website, the NOAA climate change website yesterday. They also just published, all the agencies published, their findings within their agencies on how they can contribute to the climate change discussion. So it has taken a long time though, right? It wasn't common for administrations or Congress to kind of invoke climate science as much. It seems to be happening now, but I think that kind of goes along with your point, Robbie, which is it takes a village and it takes not only hundreds of papers, but decades to get there. That seems like things are moving, at least getting it, politicians are using it. Whether or not it actually makes a difference, I guess we'll find out in the next few weeks. Some big climate legislation.
I think I want to defer to Kate because her hand's up, but then I'll say something after her.
Oh, I just really quickly wanted to point out that a lot of this stuff is not at all new science. The fact that carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, we have known that since 1896. The fact that human activities could be warming the planet, we've known that since the 1930s. None of this stuff is new. None of this stuff is cutting edge. We have known this for a very, very long time.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. That's why, I wrote an article in Forbes in frustration, candidly, a couple of weeks ago, talking about I was report fatigued after the IPCC report came out, because I know why we do it, and it's important we do it, and we must continue to do the IPCC and NCAA reports. But to Kate's point, it's basically saying things we as scientists have been saying, and just kind of amplifying it even more with a lot more certainty, which is important. But I testified before the House Science Committee in 2019, right before the world shut down, and one of the things that I found is that you get both sides of the aisle that gets to ask you questions in these House testimonies, and I didn't find it toxic the way I have seen in the past. I found that people on both sides of the aisle were actually asking fairly reasonable questions because their constituents are feeling climate change. You know, their constituents in Houston, Texas after Harvey, or in Southwest Georgia, where our pecan and peanut crop was ravaged by Hurricane Michael, or floods and drought in our state. I think they're hearing from their constituents, no matter how they vote, on what's happening locally. And even if they never call it climate change or global warming, they know something's up. And so I think the narrative is that there, at least, and of course, even with the sort of a change in administration, there's a lot more, I'd say, climate change in places in the government system that there haven't been. What I mean by that, and I keep my ear to the ground on this, as many of my colleagues on this panel do, most of the climate science historically has been in the science agencies, EPA, NOAA, NASA. But now I'm seeing climate discussions in the Department of Health and Human Services, or HUD, Department of Transportation. And so that's a positive.
Yeah. I saw Bern, I saw you unmute yourself, so I assume you wanted to contribute.
What Marshall just said at the end is it's not just about what you see in Congress. It's about how it's playing out in all of the departments that you're seeing across our entire bureau there. From housing, economics, I mean, all of them are bringing climate people in, and climate is being infused into the conversation in meaningful ways that, as Kate said, could have been done decades ago, but it is happening at a different level.
In finance, it's happening in finance now as well. So I guess that's an important part of this, right? I noticed that sometimes I did a podcast last week with some folks in Tampa, and there was talk of, well, climate change may be good for us. You know, it'll warm up. If it's warm, it's going to be good. And I'm thinking to myself, wait a second, I thought that talking point died 10 years ago. You know, but it hasn't. It's still around. And when you kind of run into that opposition, my default is not to try to plow through it, because, you know, I played basketball. I'm 5'10". I could never plow through anything. I had to do 360 around the back things to try to get the ball in the hoop, which is sometimes what I still have to do. So I guess the big question is, so this is a good question. Do we spend our time trying to convince folks, if they are kind of, you know, if they are difficult to convince? Or do we spend all of our time trying to convince the folks who are intrigued by climate change or are concerned in some way to get them to take action, right? Because meteorologists, I always see them complaining about how they're getting negative comments on social media. I just ignore everybody. And people have left me alone for years now because they know I'm never going to engage them, ever. I don't waste my time with them. But there are some people who engage, right? Trying to come up, like Catherine Hale is a good example of someone who tries to figure out ways to reach people who are the hardest to reach. What you say, panel, Vanessa, what do you say? Do you spend your time trying to convince folks, you know, give them the science, or do you, like I do, talk about solutions? Like I'll often bring in, but, you know, regardless of what you think, wind and solar and energy efficiency, it's going to create a lot of jobs, and it's really good for our economy. And by the way, if we don't do it, China is going to do it. So I'm curious, Vanessa, how do you engage people in that way?
Well, I think we're beyond trying to convince people. If you're not on the board yet, I think it's going to be nearly impossible. So almost a waste of energy there. But I want to go back to something Marshall said earlier, that there have been no more obvious examples of how our lives will be changed moving forward by climate change than there really have in the past 2 years. I mean, we have seen so many things. And so I think seeing is believing, and hopefully we have far more people on board than we did 2 years ago. But yeah, I definitely am not in the business of convincing people. I actually have a big aversion to people trying to put their opinions on me personally. I'd more prefer to say, hey, this is happening, and here are some things that as humanity we can do, but right. I'm not going to convince you one way or the other.
You're not going to waste your time arguing. And it's funny you say that, because I see Kate just posted an article she wrote, and it says why I won't debate science. So, you know, we don't have time to read the whole article, Kate, but what is the basis of that? What does the article say?
I mean, it's basically, I'm a terrible debater. You know, I will lose if I try to debate science. But that doesn't mean that the science isn't right. And I think we should not be in the business of putting established facts about the world that have been, as other panelists have mentioned, arrived at by this painstaking community process of peer review. I think once we put those up for debate, we've already lost. But I do want to say very quickly that, you know, the answer to your question, I think, is all of the above, but not all of the above done by one person. So, you know, I don't think that I can talk to certain communities very well. My message, my presence, my identity doesn't resonate there, but somebody else might. And I think that's why it is really important, as Robbie has pointed out, as Marshall has pointed out, to get more people engaged in doing this, because one person should not and cannot do this for the entire scientific community. We need so many voices out there communicating.
Yeah, and could I add to that? I kind of I sort of have the same take Kate has. I mean, we have to remember the 6 Americas, and there's 7 to 9% dismissive that they're just going to be that way. And so don't waste your time with those 7 to 9% dismissive. Sort of focus on that sort of those 2 categories in the 6 Americas, just to the, I guess, left of there. I don't hate to use that terminology because they're the ones that maybe still are skeptical or whatnot, but they're not dismissive. You're not going to move the needle with dismissive folks at all. So I agree there. But if you do go into places, you know, I was on a call with the American Academy of Arts and Sciences the other day, and there was an actor, I can't remember his name, he's on this panel with me, and he says he actually deliberately does the opposite of Kate. He actually goes to the audiences that make him uncomfortable. He says if he's going to an audience that makes him comfortable about climate, he doesn't feel comfortable. He goes to the audiences that make him feel the most uncomfortable, and then he tries to connect, as Catherine Hayhoe often talks about, with value systems that matter. And I did that recently in a very conservative county here in Georgia, where I spoke to their Chamber of Commerce about climate change. And it's a county where I guarantee you there's not a lot of discussion about climate change in the state, but I disarmed them. I talked about sort of values that mattered to them.
There's a great lesson to be learned by engaging with folks like that, because first of all, if you do it in an honest way, they tend to respect you. It's hard to do it online, you know, on Facebook and Twitter, but it's easier to do when you're face to face. And you really learn, I think, a lot about communication. You know, and back to the point about debate, it's impossible, and Kate's right, to debate, because when I was in this podcast last week and I was getting things thrown at me that I haven't heard in 5 or 10 years, I was like, I don't have time to bat down every single one of these things. That's not a winning strategy. I'm going to lose this debate, because that's how debates are organized, right? They come up with one point that kind of, and then it takes the conversation in a different direction. So instead, I framed it in a way where I thought it might resonate with them, which is if they're coming from this angle, then they probably believe that they want the United States to be the superpower that we are right now forever. And so, but I also believe that climate change allows us, if we tackle climate change and we move forward very quickly on all these new solutions to climate change, that it will continue our economic prowess. So it kind of benefits us in that way. And I speak about it in that way. But I think, you know, Bernadette's a good person to bring in on this, because Marshall and Kate both mentioned that they're not always the right person, right? Kate said, I'm not always the right person. People are not going to identify with me. But Bern, you have meteorologists in every market in this country. And in some cases, those people are the right people, because they sound like and look like the people that they're presenting to in those areas. And they may even have a political bent that's the same as those people. And they may still believe that climate change is real, or not believe, I should say, accept that climate change is real as meteorologists, because they also respect the science.
So first of all, I think there's a difference between a conversation and a debate, right? So there's a lot of ways you can have conversations. I mean, I'm a huge advocate of conversations, and I will converse with anyone who's not yelling at me and is kind. I will take that conversation and dig in if they really mean it. Now, again, the first and the golden rule of all communication is know your audience. And this applies to absolutely everything. And there's so much to unpack for that. Social media is one form of communication. It's very different than in person, or if you're on air, or if you're writing an article. I mean, there's so many different ways, and you have to know your audience when you get into any form of communication about anything, let alone this subject. So a couple of things we do tell people when they're engaging in this: first, know your audience with topic, tone, timing. meet people where they are, right? There are shared values. There's ways to connect with people. If you're entering a room, as Marshall was just saying, where they're gathered for a specific reason and there's a commonality, then you get into that commonality and then you make the connection with them. Because there are more things that unite us in this world than divide us. So we should focus on those instead of all of this division, because it's only building more division and it is awful. Another thing, simplify, drop the jargon. You don't have to be the biggest publisher in all climate science to have a conversation with someone about something. So don't feel like you have to be. You're a human being and you've had an experience in this world, so you're entitled to a conversation. Do it in a way that's comfortable for you. Personalize, localize. And there's so many different ways to do that. From our perspective at Climate Central, we often do that through data or ways to jump into a topic. I mean, for example, food, we'll get in through fruit or something like that. So there's different ways to take a big topic, health, get in through your kids, get in through your community, ways of life, things, sports. I mean, we were just talking about that before this panel started. There are things that people value, and you can localize and personalize through that, because unfortunately climate change has now affected all of those, and it's sad to say, but it's true. Tell a story. That's how you tap into an emotional side of people, and you can take a conversation to a whole new level. Tell a story and connect on that shared level. Don't be afraid, because science is on your side. I mean, when you really come back to that part of it, no matter where you are in your role in society, whether you are a publishing scientist or whether you're a human being walking down the street who just has experienced this in some form, you have a story to tell and you have a conversation to tell. So that's what we try to tell people. And it's, again, for people in your community, as you were saying, there's different TV meteorologists, different journalists around the country, different things are important. It might be an agricultural story. It might be a beach story, and it might be a transportation story. It might be a vacation story. I mean, there are so many things that you can jump into that, unfortunately, again, climate change has affected. And it's not just on the negative side here too, Jeff. There are so many amazing things going on that people are doing right now, because we focused on a lot of the negative, but I know all of the people on here also are those types that take it to the solutions level and what is going on in a positive level, how we can solve these issues and what can be done. And that's really happening on local levels, even more so than on national and global levels. So there are even more stories to tell on that level.
So the idea is kind of trying to find a gateway for people to kind of be introduced to climate change in not a threatening or negative way, such that they become intrigued. Sometimes it's like planting a seed. So many times in life, if you want to help someone with something, you have to plant the seed and let that germinate, and let them kind of take it from there. So we have other questions that I want to get to, at least one or two if I can here. Someone asked about faith. And the question here is, curious if anyone has worked with faith communities, and what are the ways scientific and professional communities can work with faith communities on mobilization. When I started out in this, I thought to myself, Christians, if they follow the Bible, then they must believe that we should care for this earth. If they believe that God created this earth, it's God's earth, then therefore, as Christians, we should be good stewards. And what I found out is that there's kind of two sects of thought, right? There's the dominion thought, which is that, we are here to kind of to have dominion over the earth. And then there's also creation care, which is we're kind of managers of the earth, and we're here to kind of take care of God's earth. So have any of you, do you have experience with talking to faith communities? I see Marshall.
Yeah, I'm nodding my head, and I just dropped in the chat, although I know that everyone on the webinar can't see it, but an article describing it. An article a couple of years ago, several scientists here at the University of Georgia worked with the Archbishop or Archdiocese here in the Atlanta area. It was around the time of the Pope's encyclical, and so we wrote a climate action plan essentially for the sort of Georgia or Atlanta-based Catholic Church. And so, as you noted, Jeff, no matter what faith you follow, there's probably some scripture in there about or text about stewardship of earth. And so again, just exercising what Berardelli said, we know our audience and we tried to connect with the faith-based value system that connected. I am a scientist of faith, which is interesting because I have certainly had people come up to me and say, well, it's blasphemous to think that humans or mankind can change God's work, the weather, the climate, and so forth. Like we do it all the time. Have you seen pollution? Have you seen urban heat islands? That's humankind changing the weather and climate. And so we certainly can do that. It's not blasphemous. It certainly doesn't sort of counter conflict with my own faith beliefs. So, I try to disarm this narrative that scientists and people of faith are somehow uniquely at odds with each other. So,
certainly the needle has moved, and this summer it's moved something like 8 or 10 percentage points in terms of people's concerns about climate change. And from, in the last Yale George Mason polling, from March until now, it increased by something like 8 or 10% in a couple of categories. And I kind of think to myself, it has to be due to all the crazy weather this summer. I mean, the European floods, the Pacific Northwest heat wave, which was something that was just off the charts for us. Oftentimes when we see those jumps, though, they only last a couple of months, and then they kind of go back down to size when people forget that, crazy weather is happening and we get into lulls in the weather. But I do think we've gotten a critical mass of the public on board with climate policy and climate concern, but there's still so much money in the way, and our government is not purely democratic. So how do we break this logjam? Because it's not so much people and voters who are necessarily in the way. In some cases, it's just that these voters do think that climate action is important, but it's very low on their list of priorities, especially folks who might consider themselves more conservative. This is the biggest, would you agree that this is the biggest obstacle we face now? It's in trends, these behemoth corporations that are making a lot of money off of things that have been established in our economy for decades and decades.
I would say greed is our country's biggest challenge. And it goes back, Kate, you were talking about for how long we've known these things. The barrier has always been, I think, money, because, money talks and you got to keep the money flowing. So personally, I think that is a barrier that sadly, I'm not convinced we'll ever breach in this country. Personally, again, it's my personal opinion.
I can understand being pessimistic about that. I wrote an article recently about the word opportunity. Climate change is an opportunity. I say that all the time, and I believe it wholeheartedly. I feel personally that's a message we need to just keep hammering home. And this is something we talked about a little bit here, but to get the message across to viewers, you have to sometimes say things 30 times. People have a lot of noisy distractions out there. So to me, it's how do you speak, in our culture in America, and money is important and success is important. So how do you then frame it in a way for Americans as a whole to understand? And to me, that's speak of it in a way where there is opportunity, because there is tremendous opportunity in so many ways. If we combat climate change, that we actually produce opportunity for Americans all over the United States.
I think the current administration is trying to help you in your mission with that particular sentiment. I still feel
but it comes from a Democrat. The point is it's coming from one side of the aisle. And so even if it makes a lot of logical sense, and it's not just on that side, right? If a Republican says something logical, Democrats, close their ears to it. So, it's kind of like Al Gore, who is, did a lot of great things, but once he took the issue, it became a little more partisan. It was harder to get the other side to kind of latch onto it. Once it was adopted on one side of the political aisle, it became toxic on the other side of the political aisle. We see that. That's the hardest challenge we face, right, guys? I don't know. That's my opinion.
Yeah. I think from a financial, go ahead, Robbie, because you had your hand up, I think.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, thanks, Marshall. I would just say, the money needs to flow, but where it needs to stop flowing is into politics itself. That's the reason we're in this mess. There are many other countries in the world where left and right broadly agree on climate, actually. And so it's not really a political issue, because you use the word conservative. That's so close to conserve. And what we're talking about is conserving and restoring. So it's not really about politics. It's more about, as Seinfeld says, which jersey you're supporting right now. Because as long as you got the players change, but the jerseys stay the same. So that's really all it's about. And by getting money out of politics, that's the only way you can do that.
Yeah, but I was going to quickly add to that, and I know we're running short on time. I always go back to what Upton Sinclair said. He said it's difficult to get a man or a woman to understand something when his or her salary depends on them not understanding it. And so that's really at the root of what's driving a lot of the sort of embedded institutionalized challenge to the science. But speaking of conserve, I know this is a communication workshop. There was a study, I think it was a German study, that showed that even conservatives, when you frame climate change in terms of, do you remember how things were in the past? Or do you remember when that lake or that field produced this many tomatoes? Instead of sort of saying how bad things are going to be. So there was a study that showed that when you frame the discussion in terms of conserve or restoring, as Robbie just mentioned, it tends to resonate. So understanding these little tricks of the trade, or even these nuances of who your audience is, as Bernadette mentioned earlier, I think is important. And I just, like, if I don't say anything else, thank you all for allowing me to be a part of this.
Yeah, so I was going to say, we're kind of out of time. I'll just ask any of you if you want to jump in and say one last word, and then I think Andy is going to kick us offline. Anybody else?
I'll just say real quick that I think things are changing. Things are changing in the climate very quickly, but things are also changing in the politics, and things are changing in the economy very quickly. I think that we are winning. I think we got to win faster, and I think we can.
Good. Want to leave on an optimistic tone.
Absolutely. And I'll just come on to thank you all for being here today and for driving this conversation forward. I've done 230 or so of these on my Sustain What webcast, and each one is.
And that was just this morning.
Yeah, that was just this morning.
It's amazing.
This is an iterative journey that we're on, and just as the science is iterative and always inspecting its own trajectory. So the more we can cross-fertilize, the more we can connect with varied audiences to find these common points and find the point when an infographic makes a difference, the point when a better conversation makes a difference, the point when more time is granted by universities to their young scientists, particularly, to talk to someone in a different discipline. Those are all frontiers that need urgent attention. And with all that added up, you end up with a great sense of possibility going forward amid the but often in the news process ends up focusing on the doom and gloom. So thanks again. This is the Lamont-Doherty Earth Observatory open house. There's more activity all through the day and tomorrow too. Andy Revkin from the Columbia Climate School will be following up. So anyone who has a way, I'm easy to find. So at Revkin, just tweet at me, yell at me, find my email address and get in touch, and I can follow up with everyone here. Thank you, Robbie. Thank you, Bernadette. Marshall, good to see you again. Jeff, keep at it on CBS. And the same for Vanessa on CBS. And Kate, thank you for being here.
Thank you, everybody.